What wasn't Israel to do until the sheaf of the first fruits was offered to God? This is the question that we seek to answer today as we continue our verse-by-verse study of the book of Leviticus on Walking Through the Bible.
The glory of His cross.
If you have a Bible with you, you can turn to Leviticus 23. We're going to be reading from verses 9 to 14. If you don't have a Bible, don't worry. Just follow along with us on the screen. The version that we'll be reading from is the New King James Version. So, Leviticus 23, beginning at verse 9. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the children of Israel and say to them, When you come into the land which I give to you, and reap its harvest, then you shall bring a sheaf of the first fruits of your harvest to the priest. He shall wave the sheaf before the Lord to be accepted on your behalf. On the day after the Sabbath, the priest shall wave it. And you shall offer on that day, when you wave the sheaf, a male lamb of the first year without blemish, as a burnt offering to the Lord. Its grain offering shall be 2/10 of an ephah of fine flour, mixed with oil, an offering made by fire to the Lord, for a sweet aroma. And its drink offering shall be of wine, 1/4 of a hin. You shall eat neither bread, nor parched grain, nor fresh grain, until the same day that you have brought an offering to your God. It shall be a statute forever, throughout your generations, in all your dwellings. In this chapter, we get the feasts of the Lord for the Hebrews to follow under the law of Moses. In our last lesson, we discussed the first two feasts, the Feast of Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Both of these feasts would occur in the first month of the year, with the Passover being observed on the 14th day of the month at twilight, and the Feast of Unleavened Bread starting immediately after on the 15th day of the month and lasting for 7 days. This makes an 8-day feast that was often referred to in the New Testament as one feast, either the Feast of the Passover or the Feast of Unleavened Bread. During both feasts, the people were to eat only unleavened bread. On the first and last days of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, a holy convocation was to be observed in which no customary work was to be done. It is important that we realize that neither of these days are called Sabbaths, even though they acted a lot like Sabbaths. Why is this important? Because it will not only help us with today's reading, but it will also help us in understanding the events concerning Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection. Because of a lack of knowledge concerning the timing of these feasts, it has led to a lot of confusion as to which day Jesus was crucified on and which day he arose from the dead. When determining the truth on the matter concerning the timing of events, and even the events surrounding today's reading, what we're going to rely on is what Leviticus literally says here, not what might be observed today by the Jews or what some extra biblical books may say. The only book that is inspired is the Bible. Coming now to verse 9. We don't have a feast per se, we have an observance. The exact timing as to when in the calendar year it takes place is not mentioned, but when we tie it together with the feast revealed starting in verse 15, we're going to realize that this observance takes place during the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Exactly when does this observance take place during this week? That's where the controversy lies. Orthodoxy of today would state that this occurred on the day after the first holy convocation of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, meaning on the second day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. If this is the case, then the day of the week of this observance would move around because the 15th day of the first month would occur on different days of the week each year. However, is that what Leviticus 23:11 said? No. It said it would be offered on the day after the Sabbath. The Feast of Unleavened Bread is not even mentioned in this section, and we only surmise that it occurred during this week due to the next feast mentioned in Leviticus. The Sabbath, unless it is used in a way that we can prove meant otherwise, meant the 7th day of the week. It was used like that in verse 3 of this chapter. On it, no work was to be done. Therefore, the observance of the first fruits, according to Leviticus, always occurred on the first day of the week, what we would call Sunday, and that Sabbath referred to would be the Sabbath after the beginning of the Feast of Passover. How then do others claim that the observance always occurred on the second day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread? Because they consider the first day of the feast a special Sabbath. However, it was not called such by God here, and its work restrictions were not as restrictive as the Sabbath, for they could prepare food on it. Simply put, the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread was not a Sabbath. It was a holy day, yes, and like a Sabbath, but it was not a Sabbath. Such is an assumption from the text, in which tradition has codified as if it was law. Why is it important that we realize this? Well, as we'll see in our next lesson, the timing of the next feast is directly related to this observance, so knowing when it occurred is important in understanding that feast. What occurred during this observance? The sheaf of the first fruits of the harvest being the barley harvest, was to be brought to the priest and waved as an offering before the Lord. Along with the sheaf, an unblemished male lamb of the first year was to be offered along with a grain offering and a drink offering, a quarter of a hin of wine. We discussed in chapter 2 parts of the first fruits offering, but here in chapter 23 is a specific offering mentioned. Until this sheaf is waved and the offering made, Israel was not to eat of the new crops of the grain in any form. This would be a statute forever throughout their generations in all their dwellings. But before closing, we would be remiss if we didn't mention the New Testament significance or foreshadowing of this sacrifice. Jesus died on the 14th day of the month of the year, the Passover day. He arose on the first day of the week, the day after the Sabbath. That means that he arose on the first day of the first fruits offering. That symbolism is why Paul refers to Jesus as the first fruits of them that rise from the dead in 1 Corinthians 15:23. Under the law of Moses, the first fruits of the harvest were offered to God. However, under the new covenant, Jesus is our first fruits of the resurrection to new life, and now we can partake of the harvest from his offering, meaning the forgiveness of sins and eternal salvation. Truly amazing imagery that we would miss if we didn't study Leviticus. With that, our time is up for today. The Lord willing, we hope you'll join us for tomorrow's discussion of Leviticus 23, verses 15 to 22, as we continue our walk through the Bible, one verse at a time. Thank you for watching today's episode. We hope that you found it edifying and ask that you not only subscribe to our channel and podcast, but that you like and share this episode among your friends, so that the saving gospel of Jesus Christ can go out to the whole world.